So hopefully by the end of the day, you'll have a pretty good idea about how you might undertake one of these surveys. So it's kind of going to be very practical, hands-on about how you might undertake these. You will probably, if you are to do one, look up the references and get more detail then, but hopefully it'll give you enough to get you going in valuation. So the first one is travel cost. So travel cost is a revealed preference technique. And so what you're doing is trying to work out the value of usually a recreation site, and it's revealed by observing actual behavior. So one of the nice things about the travel cost method is it's based on people's actual real behavior. So people are traveling to Grand Canyon, they're traveling to Yale Forest, whatever natural resource that you're looking at. So a nice thing compared to this, compared to the stated preference techniques, is real behavior. Stated preference techniques, we ask people hypothetical questions about how they value it, which can be an issue. So what the background to travel cost is that we're assuming that if you travel to Grand Canyon, then that time and money you spend traveling to that resource says something about how much you value that resource. So that's a basic premise of the travel cost method. Unfortunately, it's not quite as simplistic as that. So the origins, it came back to 1947 when a guy called Harold Hotelling, who was a national park warden, and his boss asked him, why should I give you more money for investing in this national park? And he had to try and justify it. So he wrote a letter to his boss and saying, well, people are traveling all around America, all around the world to come to this site. I can't remember which site it was. But if they're willing to spend that money coming here, surely that has something to do with demonstrating that it must be important to them. And so the kind of basic concept came from in the late 1940s. And a few people did a couple studies, but there's no real theoretical foundations to it. And it wasn't until 1966 with Jack Clausen and Marion Knesch that they put some economic theory underlying it. So it's only in 1966 it really took hold with some good, sound economic theory. And since then it has developed. Maybe in recent years it hasn't been used quite as much when some of the more stated preference techniques are state preference, but it's still a very, very useful technique for valuing sites where people travel to. So it shouldn't be dismissed. And the way the method's developed, and it can tell us a lot more than some of the original versions. So what can we use the travel cost to measure? Current access to a recreation site. So if you've got Grand Canyon, we can measure the consumer surplus value of visitors to the Grand Canyon. So what are current people going to that site? So how far are they traveling and how much benefit they're getting? It may also look at elimination of a site. So if you've got, say, a wetland area and then there's some industrial development and they want to kind of build on this wetland area, then we can do a travel cost site to see how important it is. And then based on that, we can try and measure how important it, or do evaluation. So if that wetland site disappears, we can say something about how important it is. Some more sophisticated ones called the random parameters, random utility travel cost method. What that does is allow you to value different sites and look at the value of different attributes of that site. So if you're thinking about creating a new forest park, you can maybe take information from the other sites and infer the value of a new park. So that's kind of more kind of sophisticated use of the travel cost method. And similar with the random utility model, we can look at different elements of environmental quality. So how does a park that's got more broadleaf trees compare to one with conifers? And again, I'll describe this random utility one later on. So there's a whole kind of series of different ways that we can value our recreation resource. What is important to remember, if from last day, if you remember, we introduced the concept of total economic value, and that comprised both use and non-use values, while the travel cost method can only look at the use values. So it's only looking at people actively using that site. It doesn't say anything about people's future use of that resource or anything else, so it's just the use values. And that's maybe one of the limitations when there's been a lot of interest in looking at the non-use values of environmental resources. So if we look at the travel cost method, there are three basic models that have been used. And generally, the zonal model was the first one really introduced, and the individual and random utility modules are more sophisticated ones. And therefore, and the zonal model has a lot of basic assumptions, and to a large extent, most of the assumptions are violated. So the individual and random utility model relaxes some of the assumptions, so it collects more data and it becomes better models. So what I'm going to do over the next 10 minutes or so is go through how we might do a zonal travel cost model, and that's the easiest way of getting the concept across. And then I'll introduce the individual and random utility models and show how they relax assumptions and how they improve the way we do travel cost methods. So the zonal model was the original application of travel cost, and you can actually run a zonal travel cost model with secondary data. So if your national park has data on visitors, where they come from, you can just use that. So you don't necessarily need survey work. But most often we do collect a little bit of survey data, but it doesn't have to be too detailed. Generally, what you can only value with the zonal cost is the total value of a recreation resource. So what's the total value of that site? You can't say anything about the different quality of that site and so forth. So if the basic premise is, oops, you can just see it. We've got this, say, forest park here at some point. And what we want to do is look at people traveling to that site. So a simple method is we just create a number of zones away from that site. And what you're going to then do is look at how much it costs for people in zone 1 to travel to the site, how much people in zone 2 traveling to that site, and how much people in zone 3 and outside that zone. So it could be very simply just you use concentric zone circles, so from 0 to 10 miles, 10 to 20 miles, 20 to 30 miles, or if it's Grand Canyon, you might do 0 to 100 miles, 100 to 200 miles. So the spacing between the zones will depend largely on how important the site, how far people travel to that site. Or you may do geographic division, so look at counties around that site. And the benefit of doing that is if you've got county information, you've got an easy way of working out how many people live in that site, and therefore what proportion of people from that zone travels to it. Then what you do is you collect, or you go to the site and you say, okay, where have you traveled from? So you collect information about the number of people traveling to the site from each of those zones. Then the next stage is you need to try and work out what proportion of people from each zone is traveling to that recreation site. So out of each 1,000 people in that population, how many people are traveling? And what you can imagine is if you're closer to a site, a higher proportion will go there. So if it's, say, Yale Forest, then people in Yale will go there. It's close. There's fewer substitutes of similar type of sites close by. So maybe 10% of the population of Yale will go to Yale Forest. Where if you go further away, say New York, then maybe only 1% of people living in New York might come up here. So as you move further away, fewer people or fewer proportion of people go to that site. And part of that reason is there's more substitute sites. So if you live in New York, there'll be forests there, so why travel all the way to Yale when you can simply go to a forest outside New York? So here's some hypothetical data we've got. So we've got 3 zones, so we're assuming zone 0 is people pretty much living in the forest, and zone 1, 2, 3 and beyond. And just for simplicity, we're assuming that we get 400 people visiting. So overall, we've got 1,600 visitors, of which 400 are living in the site, 100 are in zone 1 and so forth. And a number of people in the zone, partly because if you've got 10-mile radius each zone, this area gets bigger. So again, I'm just simply assuming that 1,000 people live in zone 0, 2,000 people live in zone 1 and so forth, 8,000 in zone 3. And you can get this data, say, from census data. And then what we want to try and do is work out visits per thousand. So here, there's 400 people visiting the site at a population of 1,000, so there's 400 visits per thousand. Here's 400 people at a population of 2,000, so it's 200 visitors per thousand, and so forth. And here, 50 people per thousand. So we can see the proportion of people traveling to that site gets less and less as you go further away from that site, and that's what you'd kind of expect. So what we'll be doing is taking this information here and use it to create a trip generation function. So I'll describe that in a couple of slides' time. Oh, okay, so sorry. Then the next thing we need to do is calculate how much it's costing people within each zone to travel to the site. And with a basic zonal system, what we're doing is just getting an average cost for everybody in that site. So when we're thinking about the cost of traveling, it's not only the cost in terms of, say, your fuel and petrol going to the site, but also your time. So you're spending some time to travel to the site, and we want to try and incorporate some element of that time. So if we've got people in zone 0 who live in the site, in this model we're assuming there's 0 travel distance and time. So we're assuming if they live in the forest, so they're not going to spend any money or time getting there, they're already there. And then for the people in the other zones, zone 1 and 3 and beyond, then a basic way is just make some very basic assumptions. So in this example, we're assuming that cost of travel is 30 pence per mile. So for each mile from a zone, it's going to cost you 30 pence. And we're going to assume that you've got an average hourly rate of time, cost of time of £9, or that relates to 15 pence per minute. So sorry, it's in pounds and so forth, not dollars. But again, it's very basic assumptions about how much it costs people in terms of time, and we can add those two together. So it's a table kind of demonstrating how we might do it. So zone 0, no time, no distance, no time, so it's not going to cost them anything. Zone 1, we're assuming here that the average distance in zone 1 is 20 miles, so a mileage of 20 miles. And if it costs 3 pence per mile, that's going to be £6 in travel cost. And if they're traveling for 30 minutes and it's 15 pence per minute, that's going to be £4.50. So we're assuming that people in zone 1, it's going to cost them £10.50 to travel to that site. And again, it's very basic assumption with the zone 1. We're just assuming everybody in zone 1 will spend £10.50 traveling to that site. And we'll come back and discuss some of these assumptions. And we do similar things here. So here it's 40 miles, here it's 80 miles. And we can apply these rates to get different costs. So from different zones, the further away you are, it's going to cost you more. So there's nothing new about that. So what we then want to do is, this information here doesn't really tell us anything about how much people value it. All it says is that people value it at least that amount. So what we need to do is generate what's called a trip generation function. And what that is looking at the proportion of people traveling to a site relative to the travel costs. So what we do is use the data from the first table on the proportion of people traveling per thousand population and the data from the last table to do a regression to generate a trip generation function. So what we do is do a regression, so visits per thousand from the first table, and we're regressing against travel costs. And 1 is just the intersect. And so that's a very basic model. You might want to include social economics data in there, but for this simple example, all we're doing is regressing the proportion of people traveling to that site relative to the travel costs. And here's the results of regression. So the coefficient in travel cost is minus 7.75. So it's negative. So as travel costs increase, fewer people will go to that site. So that seems fine. So what we then do, we've got this trip generation function here. And then what we use that for is to try and work out how people might behave in terms of increasing the cost of travel to the site. So if we increase the travel costs by, say, a hypothetical entry fee, how would that reduce the number of people traveling to that site We're using a trip generation function to do that. And that information, we can generate a demand curve. So what we've got is different hypothetical entry fees. So what would happen in terms of number of visits if we had an entry fee of £10 or $10? What would happen if we had $20 and so forth? And how would that affect total number of visits? So the first, and that creates a demand curve. And if you remember from last day, the consumer surplus is the area under demand curve. So we can generate this demand curve and work out this area of the value over a number of people. We can work out the overall value of that site. So to generate the demand curve, the first point is the current situation. So if currently there's no hypothetical entry fee, it's just the travel cost. So currently, at no extra cost, there's going to be 1,600 people. So that 1,600 came from a very first table of a number of people going there. So these are people traveling from zones 1 to zones 3. So that's the first point. And then the real crux of how we work out the other points is through the trip generation function. So what we're going to assume now is if we charge this hypothetical entry fee of £10, so in addition to the travel costs, how will people respond in terms of number of visits if we add an extra £10 to that travel? Oops, sorry. So if we think about people in zone 0, so this is our trip generation function here. So 33 or 330 minus 7.75 multiplied by travel costs. And so zone 0, the travel cost is our £10 here for its hypothetical. So we're adding an extra £10, and that will give us 249 trips. So by working through the trip generation function and saying if the travel cost is £10, we will get 249 trips for zone 0. So that's that first bit in this table. Then for zone 1, the original travel cost was £10, so that's how much you're actually spending. If we add this hypothetical £10, it makes it £20. And we take it through the trip generation function, and that gives 169 visits per 1,000 people. So what we're estimating is visits per 1,000. So that's 169. In this case, it's 2,000 people. So we'll multiply that by 2, and that gives us our 338. And similarly for people in zone 2, original travel costs were £21. We add on that £10 hypothetical entry fee. So the new total cost of travel is £31. We add that, sorry, we don't have that up here, but we add that in, go through the same process. Through this trip generation function, that will come up with 88 trips per 1,000 people. There's 4,000 people in that zone, so we'll multiply 88 by 4, and we get that amount. And if we do it for zone 3, adding an extra £10 will mean that's actually negative. So by adding an extra £10 to people in zone 3, they won't actually travel to the site. And then what we'd work out is add these up, and we get 939. So if we increase the cost of travel through this hypothetical entry fee by £10, we would reduce the number of people going to that site from 1,600 people if there's no travel cost to 939. So that becomes our second point in our demand curve. And then what we do is say, okay, what if we add £20? And we go through that same process, and we'll get a reduced number of people and so forth. So if you do that with the data we've got, we get this demand curve. So point 1 was 0 hypothetical entry fee, point 2 with 10, point 3 with 20, and so forth. And after about £42, then nobody will travel to that site. It's going to be too costly to go in there. So that gets our demand curve. And if we then work out, so we can do differential calculus to work out the area under there, and we can get the value. I think it's about £1,000 or something in this case. So you can work it out yourself. So that's kind of very basic zonal travel costs, how you do it. So you're not actually using the cost of travel directly to work out the value. What you're doing is you're using the cost of travel to estimate the trip generation function, and through the trip generation function you can work out a demand curve, so how people respond to different costs of travel. and that gives you demand curve, and we can work out the value. So within that, there's a whole bunch of assumptions. So we're assuming that the populations in each zone is homogeneous. So everybody in each zone has the same travel costs, we've got the same income, the same socioeconomic backgrounds, and we're also assuming that people across the zones are similar in terms of their socioeconomic status. And clearly that's not quite the case. People face the same travel costs, and again, that might not be the case. So where I live in Wales, I live on a nature reserve, and I'm at one side of the estuary. But if you want to travel to nature reserve from the other side of the estuary, you've got a 30-mile detour. So even though it might be just 1 mile away, you might have a 30-mile trip compared to people on the other side, where it's a village about a mile away. So people don't face the same travel costs to get there, even within each zone. And you might have to adjust for that. Travel is viewed the same way as an entry fee. So if you jump in your car and travel 10 miles and it costs you $5, do you think about that $5 in terms of your fuel use the same way if someone tried to charge you $5 an entry fee? And again, people tend to not really think too much about the cost of travel, but they do think about handing over an entry fee. So there might be issues there. Another big debate is how much you value time. So what is my opportunity cost of time? So is it my wage rate? So if I worked in McDonald's, I get $10 an hour or whatever you get. So am I giving up that time of making $10 an hour from working at McDonald's? And you could argue that case, but if you're on a salary, then it's very difficult to work out what your hourly rate is. And also, would I want to give up my time, or would I actually work extra? So my recreation time is probably less than my actual work time. And there's a lot of debate about what the value of time is, and I'll say it a little bit more later. Another big issue, if you go to one site, so if I fly over to America and say go to Grand Canyon, is my visit to Grand Canyon the main reason for coming to America? And it might be. I might think, wow, this is amazing. Or am I in a business trip where, so for example, I'm over here next to New York, I might decide over a weekend to see something in New York. And it's, do you include my whole travel costs from the UK, or is it just from New Haven? So there's a whole bunch of issues about how important the site is in terms of your recreation trip and how you deal with it. And do you take it from your holiday address or so forth? So again, it's another big issue we need to think about. And in the basic zonal travel cost method, these are all kind of big issues and very sweeping assumptions that we can't really rely on. And so the individual and random utility travel cost methods have been developed to try and relax some of those assumptions so it kind of better account for some of these things. So if we think of now of the individual travel cost, rather than assuming everybody in a zone is homogeneous, what it does is collects actual data from each traveler. And so you work out each individual, where they travel from, you work out their actual cost of travel, so you've got individual specific data. So it's a much more refined way of doing it. It might cost a little bit more in terms of data collection, but I think it's definitely worthwhile in terms of being more precise about it. So basically, once you've got the individual data, you go through the same trip generation function, but it's based on individual data points rather than the zones. So that's the way that is estimated. The kind of state-of-the-art in travel cost is what's called the random utility travel cost. And I'll say a little bit more about random utility theory when I talk about choice experiments. But what it basically means is that you have a choice about which site you go to. So if you're thinking about forests, maybe around Yale there's 5 different forests within an hour's drive. So you, as someone who's going to go walking in the forest, you choose which forest you prefer. So your choice will depend on the attributes of that forest. So if you're going mountain biking, it might be different forests with mountain bike trails where others don't have. If you're going walking, it might be ones which have got more nature there to look at. And the forest will be different distances to you. So what the random utility model does is look at the suite of alternatives and substitute sites, looks at the attributes of those sites, and tries and works out why do you travel to that particular site? What's the benefits? What's the environmental quality of that site to make you choose to go there? So what you're analysing is people's choice of forest to try and then ascertain the value of that forest and different components of it. So once you've got that data, then you can work out the value of that site. So you can make things like choices of whether you go fishing or whether you go walking in the forest. So a random utility allows you to identify reasons why people go to that site and also why people don't go to that site. And you can get much more information about why people go to that site. And this is only one of the travel cost methods. You can really get an idea of the value of different site quality, the value of conifers compared to broadleafs and so forth. And therefore, if you're thinking about managing a forest to, say, plant more broadleafs, through this technique, you can see what the benefits of that different management regime might be. Okay, so that's kind of broad overview of the different methods. What I want to do now is just explore some of the theoretical assumptions and some of the issues. There are still lots of issues you have to think about, and there's no right or wrong way to addressing it, but the main thing is you have to seriously consider it. So the first thing is the type of traveler. So the best kind of type of person is a day trip. So if I come from home, I travel to that site, enjoy myself, and go back home. And if everybody did that, travel cost method would be great. There's no real problem. You know that people are just traveling to that site for that reason, and therefore we can assume that all the travel cost is related to the use of that site. So that would be great, but unfortunately people are more complex. You get people in multi-trip destinations. So if people are on holiday, so if I come to the States, then how do you know that my main reason for coming here is to go to Grand Canyon or whatever? Or was I just happening to drive past the Grand Canyon and thought, oh, what's a big hole? Let's have a look at that. So you need to try and work out how you do it. One possible approach is saying, well, if someone's on holiday, you only look at the cost from their holiday hotel to, say, the Grand Canyon. So I might be staying in Phoenix and I drive up to Grand Canyon. So I only use the cost from Phoenix to Grand Canyon rather than the cost from a UK flying over. And so at least there, you know you're going to get a conservative estimate and you're not going to overestimate it. So that's one approach, but you might want to be more sophisticated on it. So these type of multi-trip destinations violate two basic assumptions in the base travel cost method. So first one is that travel costs people occur is a good proxy to the amount they value that site. So if you've got multi-trip destinations, we don't know if that's quite the case. And the travel costs can be simply calculated. Well, they can if you're just people on a day trip, but you need to really think carefully about how you think about travel costs. You need to ask how important that site is to your overall holiday experience and so forth. And you can maybe adjust it in that way. So there's a whole bunch of ways that have been used to try and deal with that. The second big issue is the value of time. So should it be a fixed percentage of my wage rate? So should it be 5% my wage rate or 30% my wage rate? Or should it be actual cost if I worked overtime, but I don't get paid for overtime, so that doesn't work. But if I worked in McDonald's, I would get paid overtime. So there's issues about what is your opportunity cost of time in terms of a recreation experience. And to a large extent, people have agreed it should be maybe about 30% of your wage rate is a kind of reasonable assumption for your opportunity cost of time for recreation. Then there's other questions about, should I include only the time traveling to the site, or should I include the time at the site? So if I'm going to Grand Canyon, I was going to say I ran up and down it, so it took me an hour and a half to get up and down it, but most people 6 hours or whatever. But they're spending 6 hours in the Grand Canyon. Should I include all that time for it, or should it just be my time traveling? So I'm giving up 6 hours to be here, so maybe you should include it. So again, there's a bit of debate on that. So there's good debate by Cesario on how you should include time and the different theories to it. And again, nobody's really concluded, but the main thing is as long as you're explicit about what your assumptions are, and you might want to do some sensitivity analysis on it as well. Then there's how you specify trip generation functions. So in the basic zonal travel cost model, we're aggregating everything across everybody living in that zone. So it's very basic in terms of that. And you're not getting any variation in terms of people's social demographics or differences in people's travel time. So the chances are there's going to be lots of error within that approach. And some have questioned whether the zonal travel cost method actually violates random utility theory. So it's not really sticking to economic theory about how people choose to consume different goods and services. So there are issues about the zonal travel cost method. The individual one where we are collecting and including demographic variables, then it aligns much better to economic theory, so it's a lot better that way. And then with the zonal one, we can add in environmental attributes, so we get much more information about the environmental quality or the value of environmental quality of different sites and how people relate to different substitutes. So, okay, so to kind of sum up about the travel cost method, it's an excellent and probably one of the best ways of working out the use value of a recreation site. So it's a really good technique to use. The early zonal model, it was great in terms of demonstrating how you can do it in first developing it, but there's lots of assumptions there, and a lot of those assumptions create problems. But for random utility one and individual one is much better, so they're quite highly recommended, especially the random utility one. They're quite highly regarded. Okay, the second main technique is contingent valuation. And this is a stated preference technique where we use surveys and we directly ask people how much you're willing to pay for this environmental resource. And my PhD was on contingent valuation in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. And what was great is this huge debate going on about whether it's valid. And there's a big review from NOAA about whether contingent valuation can produce real value estimates. And it was just about a time I was about to submit my PhD, and there's dodgy whether they're going to say contingent valuation is rubbish or it works. Fortunately for me, they said it works with some other issues. So I managed to pass my PhD. But was a fascinating academic debate, and for that sake, it's a really interesting case study. So what you basically use is a whole bunch of surveys, and you go out and ask people, what's your maximum willingness to pay, so WTP is willingness to pay, for an environmental good or service. And because there's market failure, due to reasons we described last day, then no market exists for this. So you have to create a hypothetical market. So you have to describe a set of circumstances in which this environmental good might be provided, and also how people would have to pay for this environmental good. And some of the debate has been saying, well, you're asking a hypothetical question, so do you get hypothetical answers? And we'll come to that later on as well. We say here it's willingness to pay, but you can also ask how much you're willing to accept in compensation for a good. But generally speaking, people don't like willingness to accept. So if you ask someone how much you're willing to pay, there's a budget constraint in there. So you can only pay so much as you've got in terms of disposable income you can allocate to that. Where if I ask you how much you would be willing to accept if we cut down this forest, then there's no limit, there's no budget constraint. So I could say, yeah, I'll only allow you to cut this forest if you give me $1 million. There's no budget constraint there. Where the willingness to pay, if you're only making $50,000 a year, you can't go more than maybe $10,000 at the maximum, but probably a lot less. So willingness to pay is a much preferred method in that there is that budget constraint. So basically what you do is you work out a mean willingness to pay, and you gross it up by the affected population. So how many people is affected by this change? If we're looking at use value, it's relatively straightforward. So if I'm asking you how much you're willing to pay to enhance the biodiversity within Yale forest, then if there's 1,000 people from Yale go to that forest, it's quite easy to get that affected population. We can work it out. If you start talking about non-use values, then when people having an option of using it, or bequest values, then you've got much more bigger issues about what your affected population is. So are people in New York affected? What about people in the west coast of California? Are me in Europe affected by it? Well, probably not if I've never heard of it, but it's very hard to tie down who's the affected population when you're talking about non-use values. And there's big issues about aggregation of non-use values. Again, I'll talk about the Exxon Valdes case for that. Okay, so contingent valuations based on a questionnaire. And there's generally 3 sections to the questionnaire. The first is a description of the environmental good and how that's going to be provided. And again, it's a hypothetical description in that there's no market for it. So you have to create this story almost saying this is how it'll be done. So if we're thinking about, say, environmental improvements in Yale Forest, we might want to say that either a local trust fund or the local forest service will go and they'll plant more broadleaf woods, they'll make some open spaces, they'll dig some ponds and so forth. So we can assume that there's a potential that the forest services will do environmental enhancements to that forest. But it's going to cost money, and the only way that we can pay for it is if the population or the users pay for that. So whether it's some sort of entrance fee or it's a local taxation. So you need to think about a way in which we can get payment for delivering those benefits. So the hypothetical description needs to be realistic so people buy into it. So they think, okay, I will have to put my hand in my pocket and hand over some cash to gain that benefit. So I'll talk about that in more detail in a moment. The next thing is how you ask a willingness to pay elicitation question. So there's various ways in which you can do it, whether it's increases in taxes or donations. If you ask an open-ended question or you ask some discrete choice questions. Again, I'll discuss how you might go about that question, and there's pros and cons for different ones. And then you need to ask some background information, so socioeconomic data, people's preferences to environmental goods. So the reason for that is you want to regress willingness to pay against the characteristics of a respondent to try and justify. So it's what you were saying earlier, how do you justify it? So if you regress willingness to pay against the income, you'd imagine people with higher income will generally be willing to pay more. People who have strong environmental preferences are probably willing to pay more for environmental programs than people not. So it's trying to get information to justify your findings. So going through each of those bits and stage, so why we create a hypothetical market, because there's no real market there, so that's why it's market failure. That's why you need public provision, and that's why we're doing these surveys to try and value it, because there's no market price. And that hypothetical market needs to be understandable, meaningful, and plausible. So it has to be as realistic as possible to respondent. They have to completely buy into it, think it's going to work, believe that that environmental change will happen. So you kind of need a lot of kind of pilot testing and discussing with experts in the public to try and see what works for this scenario. And there's no right or wrong way of doing it, and different scenarios will require different ways and approaches of doing it. So you need to think about your local context. So one example might be, in a study I used in the UK, was looking at how much people were willing to pay as increases in taxes to improve biodiversity on farms. And the program was going to be an agri-environment type scheme, which would be funded by government. But if you wanted to do that, then the government would have to, or the public would have to pay towards taxes to do that. So that, and often for environmental goods, because of public funding, often environmental taxes or some sort of taxation is a useful tool for doing it. Then we get the payment instruments. So how do we suggest that people pay? So we've got their increase in taxes, which is probably the most widely used one. You could have donations to a trust fund, so some sort of charity, but the problem with that is people tend to have a certain amount in their head about how much to give to charity. So the problem with donations to trust funds is you might be uncovering how much people pay to charity rather than how much they actually value that environmental resource. So people have used it, but there are issues with it. Entrance fees can be quite good if you can persuade people that they should be paying an entrance fee, so it's a suitable way of doing it. So if it's a very restricted, say, site or a forest park, then you could possibly have an entrance fee, whereas maybe more of a wilderness area, then it might be infeasible to collect something like that. Then it's payments for higher goods, higher price for goods. So if perhaps looking at clean water, so how much you'd be willing to pay in your water bill to reduce health risks from water or to make it cleaner. So that might be an example of paying higher prices for goods. And your overall aim when you're trying to choose the payment vehicle is to reduce a protest bid. So a protest bid is someone, when you ask him how much you're willing to pay, or are you willing to pay $10 for this environmental good as an increase in tax? And if they said, no, because I pay enough taxes, I don't want to pay more taxes, that is a protest bid. What they're doing is saying they don't want to pay more tax, and not saying that they don't value that good. And so what you need to do is, after asking willingness to pay question, you ask him, well, why did you say that amount? And if you get protest bids, then you remove them from the sample. They're not really saying anything. You might get people say, I don't want to pay more tax because I don't give a monkeys about environmental improvements in this forest. And that's fine, that's a genuine zero bid, but you want to avoid protest bids. You want to try and reduce the number of protest bids as much as possible. So if we look at elicitation questions, there's kind of a whole suite of type questions, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. The simplest form was maybe an open-ended. You simply say, how much are you willing to pay for improving environmental quality in Yale Forest? How easy a question is that to answer? If I said, just tell me how much you think you'd pay if I could improve the biodiversity in Yale Forest. It's quite hard, isn't it? So generally speaking, we don't really use open-ended because, one, it's very difficult, and second, it's not how you make normal purchase decisions. If you go to the shop and you buy, I think I used this example last day, if you buy a sandwich, that sandwich costs $2, and your decision is that sandwich worth $2 to me, yes or no? And therefore, you make a discrete choice. So this discrete indicators is tend to be the preferred ways. So you ask someone, are you willing to pay $2 to improve biodiversity in Yale Forest? And you'll think about, okay, yeah, biodiversity is cool. Okay, $2, I can afford that. Yes, I'll do it. The benefit's worth it. So you maybe ask some of the one subsample $2. You might ask the next one $10, and you'll find that some people think, okay, $10 is a bit expensive. Some will say yes, some will say no. Another subsample, they say $100, and most people say $100, I can't afford that. No, I don't. I'd love biodiversity, but it's too expensive. And so what you get is different proportion of people saying yes to different amounts. So more people say yes to lower amounts, and fewer people say yes to high amounts. And we can take that information to work out the value. So it's discrete choice. There's then called a referenda. So rather than stating, are you willing to pay a certain amount, you frame it within a referenda vote. So you say, would you vote for improving biodiversity in Yale Forest if that policy was going to cost you $2 in increased taxation? And that referendum is the recommended technique. And it was recommended through a NOAA panel review, which I'll talk about later. The problem with that is referenda is great in the US because there's lots of referenda, where in the UK we don't really have referenda. So if you try and use a referenda, people don't really understand it. So we tend to stick to discrete choice rather. One of the problems with discrete choice is if I ask you, are you willing to pay $10, and you say yes, then the only information I have is you are willing to pay up to $10. I don't know if you're willing to pay 11 or 12 or so forth. So there's a whole information gap about how much you pay. Or if you say no to $10, I don't know if you're willing to pay $9 or $2. All I know is you're not prepared to pay $10. So you miss out a whole bunch of information. So going back to this discrete choice, if I ask you about $10, all I know is, are you willing to pay $10 or not? And this whole gap of information. So people start doing discrete choice with follow-up. So what that means is you say, are you prepared to pay $10? If you say yes, I ask you, are you willing to pay $20? If they say no, then I know their value is somewhere between 10 and 20. If they say yes to that, then it's over 20, and so forth. So what that's trying to do is just narrow down what the value is, so you've got more detailed information about that. So it's maybe still less efficient than an open-ended, but open-ended is just too hard. So to give you some examples of how you might frame it, here's one I did for an open-ended survey on red kites, which is a raptor, a bird of prey. And we asked people, what's your maximum willingness to pay to donate to the Welsh Kite Trust? So it's a charitable trust in Wales for protecting and increasing red kites. So red kites were almost extinct in the UK, and there's only 2 breeding pairs about 50 years ago. And now where I live, you see red kites everywhere. They're as common as crows. But that was partly due to this. But we asked them how much we were to pay to continue efforts of kite conservation. So that was an open-ended question. But what I did there was I asked half the sample the CV hypothetical question, and I asked the other people to actually put their hand in their pockets and make a donation. So I was looking at comparing at real donations with these hypothetical CV donations. And unfortunately, the results show that the hypothetical CV, people were willing to pay more, or 4 times more than they actually gave, which kind of brings the question, and a number of other surveys have got similar things, but there are surveys to try and work out how you can reduce that. So there are other surveys that have managed to work out ways in which you can get equal values. So there are issues with that element. This example of payment card. So it's a study on biodiversity in the UK I did. So what you do is you say to the respondent, here's a range of values. Pick which value you feel is most you'd be willing to pay from that list. So it kind of helps them choose a value. Some of the issues with that is you get what's range bias. So I think, okay, they're asking me somewhere between 75 pence and £700. Maybe my value should be somewhere in the middle. And there's a danger that people choose somewhere in the middle. So to test for that, you might have some sub-samples starting from 75 to 750. You might have another one from 600 to 2,000, and you might have another one from 10 pence to 90 pence, or 90 pounds. And what you should find is the mean value should be consistent across the 3 ranges. So you should be able to demonstrate that if you've got different ranges, you still have the same mean value. So if you are doing payment card, you need to do that just to validate that people aren't choosing that figure in the middle. So it can be used, but there are issues with it. Then it's just a study I did when I had a sabbatical in Iowa State Uni quite a few years ago, and we're looking at water quality in Clear Lake. We used a referenda, so we said, how much, or would you vote yes in the referenda to improve water quality as described, and we had described it beforehand, and if this program costs you $100, yes or no. And what you get is some people will get $100, some will get $50, some will get $10. So you maybe have about 8 total prices, and different subsamples will get different amount. And you're looking at what proportion of people say yes to the different amounts. Okay, how we then analyze those responses. So if you had an open-ended survey, then you could just work out the mean willingness to pay, so you could just get an average mean. However, you tend to have a big spike at 0. So you'll have a whole bunch of people saying, no, I'm not willing to pay anything. So ideally, you should use a TEEB model. So it's just a regression model that accounts for a big spike in your data. So open-ended TEEB models is how you do it. So it's just a normal regression, but accounts for a spike of lots of people saying no or 0 amount. We talked about random utility, travel cost methods, and very much the contingent valuation and choice experiments I'll talk about later is based on random utility. And what it means as a utility, you as an individual gains from consumption of a good is made up of some observable deterministic component and a random component. So basically, if I ask you how much benefit do you gain from going to Yale Forest, then I can get some information. I can ask you separate questions. So do you like walking in the countryside? What's your income, and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of things that I can ask you that might determine whether you go to the Yale Forest or not. So they're deterministic, and I, as a researcher, can work that out from you. Then there's a whole bunch of other things. So it might be that your granny took you there when you were a little kid and you've got all these fond memories, but me as a researcher is not going to work that out. There's a whole bunch of random issues that I can't work out. So if we look at the deterministic component, so you've got the intersect, then you've got the bid amount. So if I'm asking you, are you willing to pay to go to this forest, then part for your response will depend on how much I'm asking you. So if I'm asking you to pay more, the chances are you're less likely to go there. So we regress the yes-no response with the bid amount. So are you going to say yes or no? And instead here is social economic characteristics, so your income, whether you're a member of WWF or any other environmental organization. So anything else that might affect your consumption of environmental good. And we run the regression, and to work out the willingness to pay, we take the intersect over the bid amount. And so what we're trading off is all the other things that might affect you against the bid amount. And that, somehow by magic, gives you the willingness to pay amount. So you basically do this regression, and you use the coefficient of the bid amount to work out the willingness to pay. Okay, there are certain things, so I might ask you how much you're willing to pay. And there's a whole bunch of things that I need to try and remind you before you answer that question. And there's kind of a standard set of things that you need to consider before you ask it. So just before I'm about to ask you willingness to pay, I can remind you, say, well, think about the amount of benefits you gain from the environmental improvement. So you need to focus on what benefits you personally would gain from this environmental program. In order to make a payment, or in order to pay your $10, you need to think about what you're going to not spend your money on. So think about the implications of you spending $10 on this compared to all the other things you might spend $10 on. So think about substitute things you might be spending on. If the total amount you're willing to pay is not enough, then a policy might not be introduced. So that's to try and stop free riders. So just to make sure if you do want this to happen, you have to say yes. So you're not having any strategic bias. This is a type of cheap talk statement. So saying that people have tended to state an amount which is more than they'd actually be willing to pay. So you have to really think that you're going to, or at the end of this evening, or this questionnaire, I'm going to ask you for that amount. So you have to really think that you're handing it over. So you try and remind the respondent of all those different issues. And you might also think about substitute sites and so forth. So that's before you ask a willingness to pay question. And then there's a bunch of questions you need to ask afterwards. And what you're trying to do there is make sure that people are choosing a bid amount for real reasons. So genuine bid or reasons might be, I chose a policy option because I consider that the benefits are worth the cost. So you're thinking that this is the benefits I came from that program, and those benefits are worth the cost to me. So that's great. They're thinking about what they get for the money. So that's a genuine positive bid. Or you might get this, saying I didn't choose the amount because the benefits weren't worth the cost. So it's too expensive, and I wouldn't really benefit from that. So that's a genuine zero bid, and that's fine. People don't value it as that much, so they don't want to pay that much. So they're a genuine response. Then there's a bunch of protest bids. So I chose a policy option irrespective of costs. So what that's basically saying is, I thought I'd get this improvement, but I didn't really think about how much it's cost. So they're not considering a cost to them. So you have to reject them, remove them from your data set. This one's a protest bid. So I chose a policy option, but I didn't want to pay more tax. So what they're doing is protesting against the tax. So they don't want to pay for it. So again, they're rejected. And I chose randomly, so again, they're not really thinking about it, so you can't use their data. In terms of biases, a question earlier, I said what things might bias results. there's what's called incentives to misrepresent responses, so strategic bias. So if I really want biodiversity to happen in Yale Forest, I might state that I'm willing to pay much more than I really would to. So, and the people are acting strategically to try and make this happen. Applied and cube bias, so if you think about that bidding game where I had a range of prices, then that range of price might influence how much people state. So that's some sort of starting cube bias, so it might influence people's amounts to pay. So again, you have to think about how you might test for that. Scenario misspecification bias, this was a big issue, so things like part-whole bias or scope biases. So there's a big controversy that some people had done surveys where they tried to value one level of provision and then a bigger level of provision, and people weren't able to think about the difference in value of those different scopes of the policy. And people like Kahneman, Knetch, and Diamond and Hausman argue that contingent valuation doesn't work because it's not sensitive to the scope of environmental change. But research since then have kind of said, well, their studies were bad, so you can ignore them. But it was a big debate in the early 90s about those issues. Then there might be issues about aggregation, so how you aggregate, especially for non-use values. Again, to answer the question from before, how to ensure your valuations are accurate. So the key thing is you need to do lots of pilot tests to make sure that people are answering this questionnaire as you want them to. And you need to try different scenarios to make sure that you're not getting results that might be badly affected. Then validity tests, content validity. What you have to do there is you make sure that the information you're presenting in your survey is true, and so you need to talk to experts to make sure that the information you're presenting is correct. And also you need to make sure that the way your respondent perceives that information is correct as well, so they're not thinking in other ways. You can do what's construct validity, so you could compare your results from a contingent valuation study with one from a travel cost, and that might allow you to validate results by comparing to some other study. Then there's criterion validity, and there you do a regression of willingness to pay against social economic data of a respondent. So what you're trying to do is provide evidence that you can justify willingness to pay. So you'd expect people with higher incomes be willing to pay more and so forth. So you try and demonstrate people are thinking about how much you're willing to pay. And then there's these NOAA guidelines, which in 1989, the Exxon Valdez crashed in Alaska, and there was a big oil spill. And there was a contingent valuation study undertaken by Richard Carson to look at the damage cost of that oil spill, but looking at non-use values. So they did a study of people in America about how much to be willing to pay to avoid future oil spills in Alaska. So most people in mainland America probably don't get Alaska, so it's not a direct use. And as a result of that, there was a big debate. So Exxon, the oil company, said, well, actually this is all rubbish. You're asking people a hypothetical question about how much you might be willing to pay for something that happens up in Alaska. This is all rubbish. And as a result of that, NOAA set up a panel expert with Kenneth Arrow and Robert Solow, who are Nobel Prize winning economists, to work out, can contingent valuation estimate non-use lost existing values for natural resource damages? So can we use these techniques to work out the value of environmental damages? So they did a big review of contingent valuation. It was published in 1993, just as about to submit my PhD. And fortunately, they said that the panel concludes that CV studies can produce estimates reliable enough to be a starting point for judicial process of damage assessments, including lost passive use values. So what they said is, yes, contingent valuation can work. But they also said that basically a lot of previous studies were pretty crap as well. And so what they then did was have a whole set of guidelines about how or what is best practice for undertaking contingent valuation. So it was a very important kind of day for environmental valuation, and it did provide a good evidence basing. Yes, these techniques do work, but you need to think carefully about how you do it. So you need to use personal interviews. So if you've got personal interviews, you can judge whether the respondent is really thinking about it. Where if you use postal surveys or internets, then you can't really judge that. They suggest you use a referenda format, so using a discrete choice format, because that's how people normally make judgments about paying for things rather than open-ended. Although in UK, we kind of say, well, you should use discrete choice rather than that. You need good, accurate descriptions of a project. You need to remind people of budget constraints, so get people really thinking about how much they can pay and what they do or what they wouldn't spend their money words on otherwise. Remind them substitute. So if I'm talking about Yale Forest, I need to say, well, we're only talking about Yale Forest, but there might be 10 other forests you could go visit, but we're only talking about this one. So again, make sure they know what the substitutes are, and have these follow-up reasons for your choice. So a few slides back about whether they're protest bids and so forth, and they're really thinking about the benefits. So there's those guidelines, and they also had what's called the burden of proof. So when you're reporting results of a contingent valuation study, you need to demonstrate that none of these things affect you. So you need to demonstrate that you don't have a high non-response rate. You need to demonstrate that most people you ask answered this question or questionnaire. If they didn't, then it suggests there's a problem with your questionnaire. You need to do a scope test. So you need to say, here's one level of environmental change, and ask one subsample that. And you need to give another subsample and say, okay, here's a bigger change. And you need to demonstrate that people are willing to pay more for a bigger change than a less change. So by demonstrating scope effects, it allows you to demonstrate that people are thinking about the level of environmental change you're thinking about. You need to demonstrate people understand the task. You need to demonstrate that people really believe that this environmental change will happen. And you need to explain, have these follow-up questions, and reject protest bids and all that kind of things. So here's an example of the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I'm sure you all know about. It was the biggest oil disaster. And they used a referendum, so they had 4 bid amounts, so from $10 to $120. And it was I can't remember, it was thousands of people in America undertook a survey. So 67% of people said, yes, I'm willing to pay $10, but 34% was willing to pay $120. And if you average it out, you get $31. So median value is $31. You multiply it up by the population in America, and you get $2.8 billion. So this is why Exxon was unhappy, because Richard Carson came along and said, the damage, passive use damage from oil spills in Alaska is $2.8 billion. You should compensate that amount. The reality is Exxon settled out of court for it's about 10 million or something, so it wasn't near that amount. And that's why having these big passive use amounts or non-use amounts, that's why all this new panel review came into about, and Exxon was fighting against this case. So advantages of CVM: because you're creating hypothetical scenarios, there's no real limit about what you can value. You can value both use and passive or non-use values. Following the NOAA panel guidelines, it's now accepted, and there's a good set of guidelines. The problems, a lot of people argued about the hypothetical nature of a CVM. There were issues about how, or the way you pose a question might cause biases, so you have to try and count for it, and maybe protest bids. But generally speaking, and I suppose the other problem, I haven't got up there, is generally speaking, a contingent valuation can only value the whole policy suite. So one change, you can't really value different components of it easily, and that's where choice experiments come in. Okay, the final one is choice modeling. So this is what's called an attribute-based preference method. And it's almost an extension or expansion of contingent valuation. So a lot of what I've said about contingent valuation also relates to choice experiment. But what it is with the choice experiment is that we can value the attributes of the environmental resource. So again, it's the same structure of survey. So you describe the environmental good, you ask a willingness to pay type question, and you ask how people's social demographics. But the way you ask questions is you ask people to think about different policy options. So you say, we've got 3 policy options, and you describe the policy options in terms of the attributes of that options, and those attributes may be described in different levels. So the first implementation of a choice experiment for a natural resource was by Vic Adamovich in Edmonton, University of Alberta in Edmonton. And he was looking at elk hunting. So he went to elk hunters and said, okay, we've got 3 hunting packages you can go on. There's a status quo, which is a current experience, so it's what generally people were doing in that forest. And we said, well, we could actually manage that forest in different ways. So you could see different number of elk. We could have in the forest or in open landscapes. We could have different party sizes, so the number of people you're hunting with. And there's different sizes. And again, we'd get presented with a series of each choice tasks where these levels are presented at different amounts. And what you as a respondent might think is, okay, when I go hunting, I like to be in a small group. So that seems quite nice, but it's $45. Maybe that's too expensive for me, so maybe I don't like that after all. Do I like this one? I see lots of elk, is that good? It's going to cost me 15 rather than 10. So, okay, it's bigger party size, but I see elk, and that's good, so maybe I choose that one. So what you're doing is comparing the different attributes against it and trading it off against the different costs and seeing which is your preferred option. I think I showed this end of last day to some of you. This is one I did for UK Forest Commission on cycling in forests. And so here, there's different attributes of the forest, so, different types of trails, so whether it's single track trails or downhill cycling, or whether it's multi-purpose trails, whether it's obstacles, so whether it's ramps and jumps and berms and stuff on the trails, whether it's bike wash facilities, whether there's showers and changing rooms at the forest, some more kind of general visitor facilities, so whether it's toilets and barbecue sites and so forth. In terms of the information, so whether there's information about the trails on the internet or not, and the surroundings, so whether the forest is managed to look nice or whether it's just a conifer plantation. And in terms of the cost, I use a travel distance, so saying these forests are different distances. And so what the respondent was asking, well, would you travel to any of these forests or would you stay at home? So they need to think about the attributes of the forest, how far it is, and would they actually go? So that was, what's your preferred forest? And the other novel thing that I've done, although I haven't published it yet, was say, well, think about your next 5 trips. What proportion of these trips would you go to different forests? And what's neat about that, and I haven't really seen it done before, is if I'm going mountain biking in a forest, I might go to a low-key forest which is local. So I might go 4 times to my local forest, then maybe once a month I might travel a much further distance to get one with all these downhill courses and so forth. So it probably better reflects the way people make decisions about things they do on a regular basis. And you do get kind of refined results from that compared to just which is your preferred one. So I still to write up, but I think that was quite a neat way of doing it.